All right, everyone. We'll have lots of time at the social to talk, so thank you. All right. As we continue today with the session.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you here for you. That was okay. Next time. Yeah.
Give me 1 second. Okay, so as we continue today's session, I am welcoming to the stage David Coletto. David is one of the founding partners and CEO of Abacus Data. He is Canada's leading public opinion researcher. David delivers strategic advice and research design expertise to some of Canada's leading corporations, advocacy groups, and political leaders. He has more than a decade of experience working in the marketing research industry and is an industry leader in online research methodologies, public affairs research, corporate and organizational reputation studies, and youth research. On top of all of this, David has been a friend to C3, helping provide insights and advice on the political and public mood of all things. So we welcome David to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be back. We're working at that, but I will try to speak from both sides. Great to be back. I was here 5 months ago. For those of you who are here, and the world, we kind of knew where it was going, but it's nice to shared some perspectives on how the shortage economy was affecting Canadians and how that was affecting public opinion. In that time, I think we now have a better sense of at least what the political choices are going to be for Canadians as we head towards whenever the next federal election is, right? If it all goes to plan, that may not be until 2025 about the minority government and all of the uncertainty that exists both economically and politically. I'm not going to make a prediction on when that election is coming. So I think you can assume when you're meeting with MPs that they're planning to run again, always thinking about the election, but particularly in the context of a minority government that seems more stable, perhaps with the Democrat and Liberal agreement, but could at any moment kind of fall apart. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through what my latest data is telling me, give you some perspectives on where I see the political landscape going as it sort of helps inform your thinking as you're meeting with elected officials, and then talk at the end about how I think you connect your issues around cannabis and the politics that the country's facing, and then we'll have some time for questions that I'd be pleased to share with you. So my agenda today is to talk through, we're doing polls almost every week, asking Canadians a series of questions that we've been tracking for a really long time now. And so I'm going to share with you what I see as the public mood today and how that's affecting people's interpretation, their perception of politics in Canada. Talk a little bit about what priorities they signal right now are important to them and who they think would be best to deal with those. I think some of the results are quite fascinating from a survey we just finished a week and a half ago. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the uncertainty in the political system right now and how to make sense of the fact that we've got a new Conservative leader, we have a Prime Minister who says he's running again in the next election, and what the dynamic of those two individuals might mean for the coming, I would say, epic fight for the future of the country. And so we'll talk about the next election really being framed around change versus fear. I think that is what we're really headed towards. So just a quick history lesson, right? Justin Trudeau won another minority government in 2021, just over a year ago. It basically produced the exact same results, plus or minus a few seats, as the election 2 years prior. And so if you look at Canadian politics since 2019, since the first re-election campaign for the Liberals, I think we've been in a very stable political environment, despite all of the things that have happened, a pandemic, economic uncertainty, inflation crisis. The vote shares of the two parties hasn't changed all that much. Views of the political actors hasn't changed that much. But it doesn't mean it can't very quickly. And I think we're headed into a period where, as I'll show you, the Canadians are feeling pretty anxious and uncertain about the future, right? The pandemic was this kind of moment that froze the world, forced us to stay home, for a moment actually brought us together. We all felt good about government, and then very quickly that dissipated, and we kind of returned to a, quote, new normal that is more, I think, skeptical, more polarized, and more divided, perhaps, than Canada's been in quite some time. And so I'll talk about that. And I could spend an hour, by the way, sharing ideas here. You've got a new premier in Alberta, you've got a re-elected, invigorated Quebec premier. The Federation, I think, is also adding to the drama that is politics today, not to mention perhaps the return of Donald Trump and global politics being what it is. So lots of external things that are affecting how people are feeling. But when I look at sort of the public mood today, the starting point is a question that all pollsters ask is, do you think the country's headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? And as of a few weeks ago, only 1 in 3 Canadians felt that the country was headed in the right direction. And when you look at that over time, you can see we're actually at a low point if you go all the way back to March of 2021 at the beginning of the pandemic. We've had ebbs and flows. The pandemic certainly caused people to say, I don't think things are going well, but quickly rebounded for much of it. If you look at when the last federal election was, I pointed it up there, when Justin Trudeau was re-elected with a minority government, 43% of Canadians thought the country was headed in the right direction. So we're down substantially. So Canadians are not feeling overly optimistic about where things are going. When you ask them about, well, what about the world? Only 1 in 5 think the world's headed in the right direction, right? War in Europe, energy crisis, and then they look down south and they don't feel any more optimistic at all about what's going on in the United States. So all around us, not only here at home but around the world, Canadians are saying things don't feel great. And when the country is feeling defensive, when people are feeling anxious, that creates a different instinct in how they react to the political choices that they're offered. And so it's a very different environment than it was even 2 years ago when we were asked to vote in the midst of a pandemic when none of us wanted that election. Other things to keep in mind. We've been tracking how people feel about the federal government for years, and you can't really, all that matters here is the trend lines. So the green is those who say they approve of the federal government, red is those who say they disapprove. And what we basically find is that the Liberal government is as unpopular as it's ever been today, right? Almost half of Canadians say they disapprove of the job the federal government's doing, only about a third approve. And you can see, there have been moments, this little spike in the middle of the screen there, that's pandemic. So in the first few months of the pandemic, that's that rallying around the flag effect I talked about. But it really has only been since spring of this year that we see that red line start to move up. And that's an indicator that economic uncertainty, inflation are having its effect on the federal Liberals. And we know from comparative studies and elsewhere that inflation is and can be government killers. Right? It's very hard for governments to get reelected when the price of everything you're paying is going up and you don't feel like your wages are matching it. Now, when we ask Canadians, do you think the Prime Minister has been a good Prime Minister, an okay Prime Minister, or a horrible Prime Minister? There's 2 ways of looking at these numbers. First, by almost a 5-to-1 margin, people think he's horrible, then he is great. Only 5% of Canadians would describe him as a great Prime Minister. But when you combine great, good, and okay, that's close to a majority. So it's not like horrible numbers, right? Like this is not to say that the Prime Minister is deeply, deeply unpopular. You can think of some recent provincial premiers like here in Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, who was just despised. And so there was no chance she was going to get reelected. I look at these numbers and say, I wouldn't say the same thing about the Prime Minister. In fact, I lost the screen. That's nice.
Wonderful.
Oh, that one's better.
There we go. It doesn't like that one slide. I don't know why. Anyways, I would have showed you a slide that actually shows you also that impressions of the Prime Minister have never been as negative as they are right now either. Close to half of Canadians say they have a negative view of him as well. So, unhappy populace, unpopular government, and a relatively disliked Prime Minister, you'd think that the Liberals are completely out of the game. But when you ask Canadians, if an election were held today, how would you vote? They're still in the game, right? The Conservatives have a lead right now, 35 to 31, with the New Democrats at 18. One thing we've noted over the last number of months is that that Conservative lead in our tracking is sustaining itself. So There hasn't been a period since the Liberal government was elected that the Conservatives have consistently had a small but noticeable lead in this ballot tracking, okay? But for the most part, when you look at the change from the last election, 1 or 2 points isn't a fundamental shift in how people are feeling. So despite all of the things that are going on, right, and I always remind people, elections are a choice about what's on the menu, right? You go into a restaurant, you can't ask the chef for something that's not there. You have to pick what's there. And so in that context, the choices matter, right? And so this is where, in a moment, I'll talk about the Conservatives and how they appeal to a broader segment of the population. Now, if I asked you, what do you think the top issue is in the country right now?
Homelessness.
Health, COVID, what else did somebody say? Inflation. Economy, inflation. All of those, uh-oh. They don't want me to show you some data here. But I want to show you the other side, which I don't think is going to work. Okay. Top issues. Over 7 in 10 Canadians say the cost of living is the #1 issue facing the country right now, followed by healthcare, the economy, and housing. Okay. So put all those together, separate healthcare a little bit, given the pandemic, given emergency room closures, lack of family doctors, lack of nurses. That issue has reemerged post-pandemic. But we are in a moment right now where most Canadians are thinking about their material needs, right? They're thinking about the fact that whether they are lower income and are desperate because their price of groceries are up 10, 11, 12%, or they're comfortably middle class but still saying, look, I'm making changes to what I have to choose, right? I usually go on 2 vacations, and now I maybe can only go on 1. And the fortunate folks like me say, you know, oh, sorry, that's too bad. But that's important from a psychological perspective, right? There's a certain expectation about what kind of life people expect. And so in this inflationary period, that has a big driver on it. But what we've seen rising are concerns about the economy, right? Most people expect there to be a recession in the next number of months. Housing affordability, despite a decline in prices in most markets across the country, we're still well ahead of where the housing market prices were pre-pandemic. And so all of those are mixing to produce a challenging environment. Now, we good? Almost there. I want to show you, when we ask people which party do you think is best able to handle those issues, we start to get a sense of some of the vulnerability that the Liberals are facing on those big issues. Now, when I ask people, and now climate change is also on that list. It sort of ranks around 4th, 5th, or 6th on the list of top issues. So when we ask people, which party do you think is best able to handle climate change? That's an issue where the Liberals do quite well. Right? The Greens are often seen as the best, even though most people will never vote for them. But the Liberals come second, with about 25% saying they would do best. But on every other issue except for healthcare, where the Liberals are basically tied with the 2 other parties, the Liberals trail by big margins, right? So when we ask people which party is best on the economy, the Conservatives are over 20 points ahead of the Liberals. Let's see if this will work. Now I can't click. Can you move to the next slide? Housing affordability. Liberals are 10 points behind the NDP and 9 points behind the Conservatives. On the next slide. The economy, here's the one I showed you, right? If the economy becomes the top issue in the next number of years, the Liberals have a lot of work to do because far more Canadians think the Conservatives are going to handle that issue well. And you can see the challenge the New Democrats face. Only 8% think the New Democrats are best able to handle the economy. Next slide, please. Healthcare, I mentioned, all 3 parties fairly competitive, but even on an issue that the Liberals normally have an advantage, they're still either tied or trailing their 2 main rivals. And then finally, on the top issue, in which almost 8 out of 10 Canadians, on the next slide, please, say is their top issue, the Conservatives are ahead by significant margins, right? So when you look at this issue set, right now, if the election was called and the Liberals were forced into it, it'd be a very difficult election for the Liberals to win, right? I'm someone who believes that elections come down to 2 things. Do I like the political leaders? And 2, do I think the party, my vote will be determined by the party I think will do the best on the issue I care most about. Now, elections are also framing events, right? You remember the last federal election, about 2 weeks into it, Conservatives looked like they had a bit of momentum, and then the Liberals brought out the issue of gun control. That more or less, I think, sunk the Liberals because they changed people's frame. They asked people to think about their choices in a different way, but if you're following politics at all, and you're going to go meet with a number of Conservatives, Mr. Poilievre is only talking about inflation. He's only talking about that issue, and you can see why, because they have an advantage on it. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean? Well, I think as we head towards that next election, Canadians are going to be asked once again to choose between a government, on the next slide, that's been in power close to 10 years, if we have this election in 2025. Most people who observe politics at all will say 10 years, you're getting really close to your best before date. Right? Governments rarely get re-elected at that time. Doesn't mean they can't. We've had moments, we've had examples of it, but it becomes increasingly difficult. So the Liberals are up against an electorate that for the previous 2 times, only about 1 in 3 of those who voted Liberal. It's hard to increase your vote share when 2/3 of the country has basically said previously, I'm not voting for it. Unless the choice becomes polarized, right? And this is where the Conservatives have struggled over the last 2 elections, where they have been unacceptable, unappealing to as many Canadians as the Liberals were. And I believe, this is my own view, backed up by over 12 years of studying Canadian politics, that the Conservative Party in Canada right now, and for probably 20 years, hasn't had a natural majority, right? There isn't enough people in Canada under normal circumstances that would vote Conservative and win them a majority government, right? You'll say, well, David, what about 2011? Stephen Harper won a majority government. I think that was a very special circumstance. You had the Liberal Party basically decimated. You had Jack Layton, who for many, what I'll call more conservative blue Liberals, was not an acceptable option, right? So the so-called socialists sort of approaching. And it caused a lot of people to go and vote for Stephen Harper, who wouldn't otherwise had unless that dynamic had happened. And so the Conservatives have a challenge in that they need to find more voters than would normally consider voting for them. And so there's 2 strategies for the Liberals, for the Conservatives. One is expand the tent, make more people open to voting Conservative, right? If you listen to Mr. Poilievre, the new Conservative leader, that doesn't appear to be his strategy, right? Their strategy instead is all about turnout and getting their supporters engaged and hoping that the Liberal supporters feel disencouraged, skeptical, and stay home. And finally, for the New Democrats, the scenario is one where they're hoping that whenever this election comes, that they get a lot of the credit for some of the things that the federal government has done over the last few years leading up to that election. Things like dental care, right? All those things that they agreed to in that confidence and supply arrangement. On the other hand, there is some history to say that a party that has propped it up a government often doesn't get much of the credit. In fact, they're often blamed for it. And so that's the big unknown, is how does the NDP play into that? So let me share some additional data. On the next slide, please. That slide they don't like. Next slide. Right. I'm just going to go to my phone because I didn't even remember what that slide is. One important question we often ask in a survey is so-called desire for change. Right? Do you think you'd like to see a change in government, or do you want the current one re-elected? And we have the benefit of being able to track this election back over time. Today, 51% of Canadians say they definitely want a change in government. That's exactly the same number who said that in the last federal election. Right? So the desire for change isn't any stronger, despite all those weakened numbers that I showed you. But those who say they definitely want to see the Liberals re-elected is 4 to 5 points lower than it was a year ago. Right? So the challenge for the Liberals is not so much that there's even more people who want to see them removed, it's that the enthusiasm for the Liberals has dropped somewhat over time. When we look at some of the opposition leaders, for example, right? Jagmeet Singh, NDP leader, you can see his favorables going back to June of 2021. For the entire period of time, more people in Canada said they liked Mr. Singh than disliked him. He's the only federal leader who's consistently had a net positive rating. But what you see is over the last number of months, those two lines have come closer together. That's a signal. Actually, you know what's happening? Conservatives increasingly saying, I don't like you, right? Because Jagmeet Singh, prior to the arrangement between the Liberals and the NDP, wasn't really a threat, wasn't somebody that conservatives said, I'm not going to vote for you, but I don't dislike you, right? You're actually making it easier for the party I want, perhaps, to win. Well, now he's an enabler for Mr. Trudeau. And there's one thing that all conservatives agree on, and that is how much they dislike the Prime Minister, right? There's a deep, deep emotional dislike for him. On the next slide, please. What about Mr. Polyev? So we've been tracking, you can see Mr. O'Toole, the previous Conservative leader, ended on a very bad note. 43% of Canadians had a negative view of him, only 20 positive, largely driven by Conservatives who decided he's no good after he lost the last election. But for Mr. Polyev, as of the most recent data we have, he has a net negative, right? 37 have a negative view of him, 31 positive. But if we go to the next slide, two things are important to note. One is, he is far more unpopular than any Conservative leader at this stage in their mandate. He's only been leader for a month. And already 23% of Canadians have a very negative view of Mr. Polyev, right? Now 32% have a very negative view of Mr. Trudeau, but I suspect over time, these numbers are going to get really close together. And when that happens, that's what we call polarization, right? When both sides look at the other side and say, I despise, I hate, really just, don't like you. Mr. Trudeau's number hasn't been this high, and I suspect Mr. Polyev's number is going to continue to go up over time because that's the kind of politics that both sides are playing at the moment. Next slide, please. The other thing to note about Mr. Polyev is when you compare him to Mr. Scheer, who's two Conservative leaders ago, they seem to change their leader every few years now. This is where the leaders stood in their net favorables 1 month after they were elected leader, right? Mr. Scheer had -2. Most people had no idea who Mr. Scheer was. Mr. O'Toole had a +1. Most people didn't know who he was. Mr. Polyev is at -6 already, right? So within a month, he's viewed more negatively by more people than either of the two previous leaders were at this stage. So we're already seeing an indicator that the polarization, that the division between Canadians when it comes to their two main choices is pretty stark. Next slide. So when we ask Canadians straight up, if you had the choice only between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Polyev, this is how they break down. Well, 54 would choose Trudeau, 46 Mr. Polyev. And that's not much different than when we asked this question in the last election, if you replace Polyev with O'Toole or Mr. Scheer. But the thing to note about it is people often assume, well, if I'm a New Democrat voter, then I'm absolutely going to prefer Mr. Trudeau or Mr. Polyev. And for most of them, that's true. But when we look at sort of the underlying number of Polyev, 1 in 4 New Democrats would prefer Polyev over Trudeau. 1 in 4 Bloc supporters would prefer Mr. Polyev over Mr. Trudeau. Not surprising, 74% of those who support the People's Party would prefer Mr. Polyev over Mr. Trudeau. What this shows is if an election becomes a choice between change, which Mr. Polyev would represent, versus fear, which is the Liberal version of that, it is a pretty close race even then, right? And we can't assume that all New Democrats and Bloc and Green supporters will leave those parties and embrace Mr. Trudeau. They didn't do it the last 2 elections, and they don't necessarily going to do it again. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean then, from your perspective? You were here last time. I shared some data we had done in May exploring the public perceptions around legalization, and congrats on 4 years since legalization. The first thing to always remind yourselves and remind MPs is that there are very few Canadians out there who look at legalization over the last 4 years and say it has been a disaster or they actually even oppose it anymore. On the next slide, what we know is that in fact the most memorable thing the Liberal government has done for people is legalizing cannabis. I don't know if you were here in May, I showed you that slide that we asked people open-ended. Name one thing that the Liberals have done in the 5+ years, 7 years since they were elected. And cannabis legalization was at the top of the list, right? And then when we ask people, okay, here's a list of things that the government would say are their achievements, which ones are the most memorable? Overwhelmingly, people say cannabis, right? So this is obviously a head scratcher for all of you, because if you go and talk to liberals, they want nothing to do with it, or they don't want to talk about it, right? Yet it's the thing that people remember the government the most for. In fact, it's the thing that probably most, particularly young people, fondly think of when they think of the first version of Justin Trudeau that they saw, right? That Justin Trudeau who offered to do things differently, who came out with policies that were novel and innovative, right? Today's Justin Trudeau just seems like the same old kind of politician, right? So when you're thinking about how do you position cannabis for the next election, I think one of the ways is to try to get into their heads that there's opportunity to be seen again as a party and as a government that is innovative, that's thinking outside the box, that sees both the economic opportunity, but also sort of the image opportunity of being associated with. If you don't think it works politically, I think it was last week, President Joe Biden announced major pardon. I think he pardoned everyone who's ever had a federal conviction for cannabis. And why did he do that? Because in a few weeks, you have midterm elections. And if the Democrats are going to hold on to the Senate and maybe the House, they need young people to come out and vote for them, right? So in the same way that I think cannabis legalization helped Trudeau win a state majority government in 2015, Joe Biden and the Democrats are hoping the same happens for them in the midterms. Next slide. The last thing I'll remind you is, as I said, 73% of Canadians support or can accept cannabis legalization. Over time, that number has gone up. It hasn't gone down, which is a signal that all the worst case scenarios that people threw out 4 or 5 years ago haven't come true for most people. There's still opposition, and the member of parliament who was up here before me did signal certain communities, Chinese Canadians, South Asians, a lot of, I grew up in Richmond Hill. If you look at all those communities around Toronto that don't allow the sale of cannabis, there's a direct political reason why they're choosing not to do that. But beyond those groups, and by the way, those ridings unfortunately often determine elections, which is why I think you're having some challenges breaking through. The story still remains that as our country moves forward, as the population changes, acceptance of cannabis legalization is going to go up, not necessarily down over time. And so that is your strength. Next slide, please. I think I'm done. So what does all this mean? I still believe, as you say, despite the mood of the country, and I don't think that mood is getting any better, by the way. I think even if inflation starts to come down, the corresponding economic recession and uncertainty for those that have mortgages and have now seen their cost of owning that home, once they renew, if they're lucky enough to have a fixed rate mortgage, is going to be a shock. Is only going to get worse. And so this highly competitive political environment feels to me like people are digging in. And the nature and tone of our politics means we're likely going to be even more polarized. That's an environment where it's hard, I think, to offer up policy solutions for parties. Because instead they're going to look for the wedge issues that keep their voters on either side. As I showed you already, our political leaders, Mr. Pauly has only been in this job for a month, and he is despised by more Canadians probably than Mr. O'Toole was after 2 years in the same job, right, in a month. That's partly his own doing, frankly, but I think that's what he wants. He wants to create that kind of environment where his supporters are super engaged and motivated to turn out and support him, driven primarily by their dislike for the opponent. And the Liberals are going to do the exact same thing. And so as we head towards 2015, I guess my concluding point is, if we're going to have an election where it's really going to be around change versus fear, think about who each party needs to win the election. And the thing that I've noted, I wrote a book chapter about it in this academic book about the last election. If young people, those under 40, I'm going to put myself there, I'm 40. I know I look like I'm 18, but I'm actually 40. 40 and under are young. If they didn't turn out and vote Liberal in the last 2 elections, Justin Trudeau would not be Prime Minister today. Remind every MP of that every single time. And they are not happy, young people, with the Liberal government. Housing is unaffordable. They don't, the government is no longer squeaky clean and offering a new, different perspective. So ask them how you, as an industry, can help them reconnect with a segment of the electorate that they need to reconnect with and need in order to get reelected. Now the same story, though, applies, I think, to some extent to the Conservatives. Because the Conservatives have a hard time connecting with young people for various reasons. I think that Mr. Poilievre is going to do his very best to not talk about any social issues like abortion or same-sex marriage. He'll get into some difficulty around the issue of climate change with young people, but there may be an opportunity, especially around his framing of freedom, to talk about cannabis and the economic opportunities for the small, mid-sized cities. Think Belleville, right? Think London, Windsor, where many of you in Southern Ontario operate, but also in other parts of the country where the Conservatives need to definitely win more seats if they're going to be able to form a government. So there's political opportunity, I think, all around. You just need to remind those folks of how important certain segments are and how that promise they made 7 years ago helped them win that election and perhaps hold it for the last two. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. So thanks so much.